Okay, let the record show that the committee has reconvened in open session. There is no action to be taken on item number 9 as a result of the closed session. So we'll move to item number 10, which is the 2022 financial results presentation. And we'll turn it over to Mary Ann with the PowerPoint.
Okay. It's not showing. Oh,
It's up on the screen. We just have to knock down the lights for the.
oops.
Yeah, there we go.
God, it's been a while.
I can follow with me. Okay, I've got it. Very bright, very dark, very bright. Maybe a little darker. It's hard to see that screen. I think they'll dim. Try and see if that one will dim them a little bit. That actually, well, that wasn't too bad, actually. I mean, yeah, to see, so we can see the PowerPoint, and then we'll bring them back up after. That's,
How do you get it so that it's on that screen? Or can't you?
I guess it can't,
Oh,
because the
okay.
WebEx is on it.
Oh, can you stop the WebEx? Because
Yeah,
everybody
sure.
left.
I don't think anyone's left in
Robbie
the
left.
WebEx room.
I'll try to go through this fast because it's 7 o'clock now. Yeah.
How to get it on there, I'm not sure.
Oh. Hmm. Okay, well,
I asked Caitlin if it could go on there, and she said no.
oh, we used to be able to show it on all three.
I wonder if it's-
Oh,
Nope.
does it seem dark? Okay, we'll just do it. People can see.
Okay.
Okay,
We're good.
so we have completed our 2022 audit, and the audit report is ready. I think the auditors will be coming probably to a meeting in September. But I usually like to go, we kind of give different kinds of presentations. So again, we've historically focused on the general fund because that's where most of our services to our residents take place. We went through kind of the unusual circumstance we were in this year on the investment market, which produced a relatively large unrealized loss. So we have to adjust our investments to market. That market adjustment was 1.5 million. Before that, we had a $415,000 profit compared to the $1.1 million profit the year before. And so our net loss that is shown on the financials is the 1.1 million in the general fund. Again, what causes that adjustment to market is when you buy an investment at a lower interest rate and the interest rates grow. And so a buyer of that investment that has not matured yet isn't going to want to pay the same for an investment that is only yielding, let's say, 2%, when they can go out and buy a different, almost identical treasury that's paying 4%, let's say. And so they're going to want to pay you less. And that's what the financial system requires, that we adjust it to market, even though we're going to hold it to maturity, and we're going to get 100% of our principal back, and we'll earn the 2% interest or whatever it was when we purchased the investment at the time. And that's basically what we talked about. And we did several budget amendments during the year. This is just kind of a rehashing of those budget modifications that we did during the year. General fund revenues, when you look at the general fund revenues, what we budgeted and what we actually received, again, you can see under miscellaneous revenue, which is where interest income shows up. Because of that adjustment, we actually had negative revenue. But otherwise, you can see that we did pretty good. The only area that we saw less than we had expected was in the intergovernmental grants. And those really, once we knew we were and started working with Workday, Workday has pretty robust grant accounting. And in that, with that grant accounting, they want you to use a grant fund for your grant accounting. And so some of the grants that the police department had, like their BEAT grant and their VOCA grant, we accounted for in 2022 after the budget was adopted in a grant fund. So it's not that we didn't actually receive the grants, they were just reported in a different location, but the expenses were reported there too. From an expenditure standpoint, we underspent in our expenses as well. So we didn't quite do well in revenues, but we did do well in expenses. We had about a 5.6% increase in expenses from our 2021 actual to 2022 actual, but we were under budget in 2022. Kind of delving into our expenses a little bit more, if we look at our categories of general government, you can see that we did have some areas that were a shortfall. For example, unclassified was tax settlements and just write-off of bad debt. City Hall, the shortfalls there were mainly in utilities, as well as there were some repairs and maintenance that came in over budget. The finance department, really, we shouldn't have been over budget. One of the things that we do is record the accrual for vacation accruals each month. And what happened was mid-year, there was 2 months where they recorded bigger departments vacation accrual to our department, and when they reversed it out of the proper department, and so we ended up with someone else's vacation accrual, basically. So that's why we are, the main reason we're overstated, and that I didn't notice until I was actually working on this PowerPoint. So really, it's just a reallocation of expenses. Public safety, you can see that the police department, they overall were under budget. Public safety, fire department was over budget by $207,000. The police department was under budget by $229,000. Inspections was under budget by $50,000. The main issue with the fire department was utilities and overtime. They were in a situation where they were in a lot of FMLA situations with their employees and ended up paying a lot of overtime because, of course, they have minimum staffing requirements. Sure.
On the slide before
Yeah.
this, what is unclassified? What is that? Because I know it's not a large amount.
Yeah, it really is just if it doesn't belong to a department. So when we do tax settlements, when we,
Okay, that's what I wondered.
yeah.
Things like that. Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
Oops, wrong way. The other transportation and other categories, engineering and public works, you can see there is a pretty big savings in the public works budget. Garbage was a little bit over $12,299. While they have a fixed inflationary increase in the contract, we also have to estimate new construction costs, and that must not have been estimated properly. Parks was under budget. Last year, when we had our presentation by the auditors, they presented that we would be needing to make a change in how we classified leases. So it used to be that when you had a lease, you looked at it and you said, is it an operating lease or is it a capital lease? An operating lease was when you were using something and you were going to give it back at the end, and basically your agreement ended. And a capital lease was like you rent a car and you make a payment every month, and at the end you pay $1 and it's your car. That would be considered a capital lease, where it's basically a financing mechanism to purchase an asset. Now, the accounting standards have said you have to basically treat almost all capital leases, or all leases as a capital lease. And so we had to have our auditors come in and actually go through every single lease that we had with the city. They went through and evaluated each one of those leases based on the new rating criteria that has been established, and then had to book liability and an asset for those that are now considered, I guess, capital leases. And then the transfers is transfers to other funds. Yeah, that's okay.
Still new
Yeah,
to this,
no.
but, so parks.
Yeah,
I see there's, they were under budget, but, I know that Jamie Howard said in the last meeting, she was talking about, CIP, I think, we plus, that she put in and they, so many of them are not funded, cover any other.
I'm sorry. So at the last Parks and Recreation Committee, Jamie Polly was talking about how she's submitted, numerous times requests to CIP, and they don't get funded. So that the extra that's left over, does that get carried over?
It does not.
So that couldn't have been put. Well, I guess it depends what her projects were that she wanted, or can anyone shed light on that? Just because I'm trying to understand the whole process a little better. Thank you.
So some of their projects, well, they all get scored, obviously, but depending on, so one of the, just as an example, one of the projects they put forth is one called like playground replacement. And so they'll ask for a sum of money, $100,000 or $150,000 to replace a playground. And so every year they'll try to do a playground or two. And so there was a time, and I want to say maybe during the Great Recession in the 2010s, one of the first things we would cut from our budget was stuff like that. And so we got way behind on playground replacement, and then we had to play catch-up on stuff like that. So then, instead of budgeting $25,000 a year into a little pot that they would eventually replace a playground with, it was something like $100,000 or $150,000 for 5 or 6 years running, and they did a whole bunch of them. So now they're to a point with this year's CIP where they only have 2 left, and the 2 they have left were done in the, like, 2005, 6, 7 range. And so they don't have stuff anymore that's in total disrepair, that's not ADA compliant, that's not, I mean, they had a whole lot of needs. And so I think we've gotten better about scoring their projects, but then they'll have other projects like tennis court replacement where they'll resurface a tennis court. Well, they put in one this year where they want to restripe it for pickleball. Well, yes, we want to do that project, but then all of the other needs that came forward that were critical, like roofs and things, took precedence. So, there's times that they'll put a project in and we'll end up rescoring it, 2 or 3 times. One of the things they wanted was the Sylvan Hill parking lot because it's in disrepair. And so now that has not been funded. We've scored that 5 or 6 times, but we've met other needs of theirs that we thought were more important and more public facing. So, they don't get everything, but they always get something. And we don't score park rolling stock. So when they need equipment, we and the county partner to replace that stuff on a set schedule. We don't score that, and there is no, nobody says no to that stuff. They just get what they need for that year on a schedule. So, it depends on what they apply for. For a number of years, she was applying for the Memorial Park seawall because there's some erosion issues there where the lake meets up. That has not yet been funded. But, when we don't fund a project, we'll ask the department head, we have them rate their own projects, critical, high, medium, low, whatever, and kind of try to keep a 5-year mindset. And so when they rank something critical versus something medium, we take that into account. And so they always, in their plan, usually have some projects that are way more important than others. And we let them help us prioritize those. So, it's not like there's a lot of unfinished work that's critical that's not happening.
So that 89,000, could that not have been used for something, or did probably other projects were more than that? So does that make sense? Or would they have to have budget for it?
Right. We don't advocate for the departments to ask to spend what's left over in their budget on something else. We don't advocate for that. We've had situations where we've had departments, do that. So that would really become a policy decision of the council. And we have looked at it at year end and said, okay, the general fund, like last year, made a profit. And we decided what was our highest priority. And at the time, we thought the motor pool fund was, because it was, wasn't generating enough revenue to replace the vehicles on a timely basis. And so we transferred some of that profit over. And this year, yeah.
But we have had them apply for either additional spending or carryover and use it for different stuff, or repurpose it when they couldn't get certain projects done, or things became cheaper than they thought, and then they could get a little more done, or whatever. We've had that. I know we've seen it a few times even come from police departments, so, for projects that they needed, so.
That helps immensely. So basically, the total, it's always looking at what is most critical, what is usually, okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
And the worst stuff first, if we can get it, so.
Thank you.
Can I hang on to that?
Yeah.
So you're saying that excess could be pulled over to a different department?
Right.
If that department doesn't necessarily, okay, so if they need help finding priorities, we could give them some suggestions?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So when we look at, the last number of years and the impact of our annual net income or net loss to the general fund, you can see that from 2009 to 2015, we had 3 years with a profit, 3 years with a loss, 4 years with a profit, 3 years with a loss. And the net gain during that 7-year period was $427,000. In the last 7 years, 2016 through 2022, we've actually had a net gain of $4.5 million, even though we had one loss this last year. So I think that's one of the things that Moody looked at when they were rating us, was the strength of our general fund and our profits overall. And of course, even though we had a loss this year, they were familiar with that market adjustment, because if you go to literally any other government's financial statements this year, they're all going to show that negative interest income. So, they were looking more at that profit before the market adjustment. Again, kind of looking at our fund balance from 2016 to 2022, again, you can see 11 million, and then steady growth over that time period to where we are at 2022 of 14,551,000. Again, that 1.1 million did decrease our overall fund balance this year. But when you look at the change, because we look at our fund balance and we have to classify some of it as non-spendable or committed or unassigned. Unassigned is basically unreserved or undesignated, were the old terminologies that we used to use. So because we have fewer advances to the TID districts, we have less in that non-spendable category. And then from a committed standpoint, our contingency, we've always back, I don't even know how many years, we said, we were going to set aside $500,000 for commercial rehab. And they have been basically using those funds to fund revolving loan fund. And then our carryover funding that was authorized by council. So that brings us down to our non-spendable of 10,857,000 versus the 11,426,000 in 2021. And our fund balance policy says that we have to maintain a fund balance of at least 16.67% of expenditures. If we looked at that computation, we'd be at 6.2 million. Again, kind of looking at our advances for our TID districts, the general fund, as we've noted before, especially with infrastructure projects, we put the infrastructure in at the beginning of a redevelopment project. We retire the debt over time, and we collect increment over time. And during those initial years, the TIDs often have deficits. Obviously, with our pay-as-you-go developer payments, that is helping. But you can see that we now are down to a $2.4 million advance, which is down from 3.1 last year. When you look at the long-term projections, obviously TID 3, 6, 7, and TID 8 are not predicted to have deficits in future years. TID 9 is about at its maximum level of deficit. TID 10, 11, there's not any expectations of advances. So TID 12, the mall, is really our big area where we would see advances in the future. From a revenue standpoint, when we look at revenues, obviously grants and our big state grants is one area, and it was a little bit of a challenge in 2022 versus what we received in 2021, because you can see almost in each category, shared revenues, expenditure restraint, transportation aids, 2021 revenues were stronger than 2022. Other revenues that showed some big changes, permit revenue was the big highlight. We had budgeted $275,000. Our actual was $705,000, so that was a positive variance of $430,000. And even compared to 2021, which was a good year, we were up almost $200,000. Other areas that we saw some improvements were in street public charges, interfund charges, intergovernmental charges were an area where we saw the decrease, and that big difference is because during the workday implementation, we would always bill the school district for their share of our community resource officers, and that always took place after year end. And with implementation, it just kind of got lost in the shuffle until March, when we were like, oh, we forgot to bill the school district. And the accounting practices say after a certain period of time, because this is a governmental fund type, you can't consider that a receivable in that year. So in 2023's financials, we'll have 2 years of revenue. So we did bill them, and we billed them, in a timely basis for them to pay us.
So on next year's report, we'll have a big positive.
Yes.
For the double. Okay,
Right.
that makes sense.
Just a layout of where we're using our property taxes. Again, the general fund is the big user of property taxes, followed by debt service and capital. You can see that there was a big change in the capital from 21 to 2022, and that is because, if you remember, Transit received a big allocation of CARES funds, and so they used the CARES funds for their operating, and that required us to have less levy for transit. Again, you can see the exact offset there between the transit fund and the capital improvements fund. But then when we did the 23 budget, we returned it back to, its usual levels. When we look at our expenses in another way, by looking at categories across all of the general fund, we did see savings budget to actual in salaries and fringe benefits. This is just kind of a breakout by category. So when we budgeted for 2023, because we've seen large savings, if you remember, we said we were going to not budget for a couple of vacancies, and so I would expect then next year, or when we're doing this presentation next year, that we wouldn't see as big of a positive variance.
Okay.
Contractual services, we don't have to spend a lot of time on these, but just to kind of see where we're really spending, our biggest categories. Again, motor pool, the funds that we're transferring over the motor pool fund to fund capital replacement, our utilities of $1 million, refuse of $1 million, snow removal, 230, repairs and maintenance, just a breakdown, and CCITC, just under $1 million. And the same with supplies and expenses. I just thought maybe you'd like to see it. Again, for materials, road mix and salt are two biggest expenses in that area. And then our fixed charges are insurance and land rental. And that's for the snow dump site. And then the transfers out. Special revenue funds, these are our funds where the money comes in for a specific source. Just a history of where the funds are. There was nothing really that stood out in my mind as far as concerns, just pointing out, if we look at that environmental cleanup fund, if you recall, that fund was insurance proceeds for the Holtz-Krause that we were setting aside for future environmental, and we were required to set that aside by the DNR. When it was converted to the soccer fields, the DNR released the encumbrance on those funds, and so we have been using that for other cleanup efforts. So you can see that it is starting to decline each year, and at 2022, it ended at 1.3 versus 5 years before it was at almost 1.8 million.
And then,
So-
did we not use some of that for Riverside Park that's not even in here yet, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, that wouldn't be in here yet.
Okay.
So at some, the impact of this is at some point, we'll be having to levy for our ongoing maintenance costs of Holtz-Krause if we continue to use this for other environmental projects. And again, we have a lot of special revenue funds, so. The debt service fund, again, just looking at the funding sources and uses. So we retired 10.4 million of principal, spent a total of 12.3 million. Our revenue source is property taxes and then the transfers from the TID districts to pay their share of the debt. The fund balance declined just a little bit, 100,000. It goes up and down, each year depending on how things go. And if we look at, again, our net decrease in outstanding debt in 2022 for the general obligation debt was $7,065,000. We decreased our debt by $10,465,000, but we issued new debt of 3.4, bringing a decrease of $7,065,000. The debt that was due in 1 year is $9.7 million. Not the same type of results in the utility debt. We issued 24 million, retired 1.3 million. Again, as I pointed out earlier, we hadn't made any principal payments on the sewer or water yet, and they owed 5.5 this year. Again, kind of going through the debt service coverage, as I'd mentioned earlier, net revenues are really our revenues minus expenses, adding back in depreciation, because depreciation is a non-cash expense. So that's really the revenues that we have to pay debt. So if we look at the last 3 years for the water utility, 2.5 million was the net revenue in 2020, and that has grown a little bit, about 200,000 from 2020. But our debt has increased, so that results in a reduced debt coverage. And this is the number that we have to be concerned about going forward because it must stay above the 1.25. And like I said, this was without paying principal on the safe drinking water.
So once they start to make those payments on a scheduled basis, the debt coverage ratio should drop right away, right? I mean, they're going to be
And we're going to
expending
have to increase revenues, which was one
Right.
of the justifications
for the rate case.
Rate case,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And then the wastewater utility, again, very similar. We have had some rate increases, so you can see that our revenues, our net revenues are going up in this situation. Debt also has gone up and the debt coverage has gone down. This actually is closer, a little closer than the water coverage was, but our amount of debt that we issued for the treatment center or the wastewater treatment was bigger too, so it had more interest to pay. So again, keeping our eye on that to make sure that we meet what we've promised to our revenue bond holders and maintain that rating from Moody's.
So the full year 2022 isn't reflective of 12 full months of rate increase, right? Because
Right.
those things happen mid-year.
Right.
And so in '23, we should have a full year of higher rate collection.
Yes.
Right, to offset, okay.
Well, water, it didn't go into effect until July 1.
Okay, so half a year this year, none last year.
Right.
And, but the wastewater, that was in effect right away, was it
Yes,
not? Okay.
yes. TID districts, I can go through this quickly too. But again, when we look at our TIDs, I've just kind of highlighted if it's in a positive or negative deficit at the time, what the increment was in 2022, the debt outstanding, expected termination date. And you can see that we're expecting, like for TID 3, for its financial condition to continue to improve each year until retirement. The same with TID 6. You can see that TID 6, again, we're expecting that it will cash flow by the end of next year, and then we'll have about $4 million of increments. So, we have two choices. One is to go through the process of closing the TID or adopting that resolution for 1 year of carryover, and then you can use that 1 year's increment of approximately $4 million to use for affordable housing.
Right, and so when we look at that figure, the conversation we were having an hour ago about 700 grand,
Right.
this is the money where there's enough to do
Correct.
both things without ARPA.
Right, and
Okay.
the amount that 700 grand, I mean, if we use the estimates that were in, would be about 1.1 for the infrastructure and then 1.5 for the shortfall, the funding gap. So there still would be other
Almost half
money
of it
for
left
other-
yet.
Yes, for
Yeah.
other projects, loaded.
Perfect.
In-
Go ahead.
And could that be done at any time? I mean, if they, for the work,
Yes.
the sewer pipe
So-
that needs to be done, so,
Right. So one of the concerns was that this money would not be available till 2025, but they wanted to do the infrastructure project in 2024. So we conversed with Quarles and said, well, if we borrowed for the infrastructure in 2024 and did a 1-year issue, it would just be a short term, and really you would just do a regular promissory note and you would just
Like a note
have
anticipation or something?
a balloon in that first year. Yeah, you
Sure.
wouldn't even have to do, you could just have a big payment,
Okay.
your first year payment. And then you would use this increment then that was available in 2025 to pay that 1 year of debt for that infrastructure. And they said, yes, they felt that met the laws and it would be an eligible low-income housing.
Boost,
Yeah.
yeah.
TID 7 right now has basically cash flowed and has been donating increment to TID 12. So basically, it's paying for the water and sewer projects that are going on right now. TID 8 is out on 17th Avenue. We were in a deficit at the end of 2022, but you can see in 2023, we will be out of that deficit and we don't expect ongoing deficits after that time period. TID9, like I say, this should be its lowest point because it is retiring its final debt in 2023, so maybe a little bit lower when we finish this year, but it's not going to be significant. TID 10 is cash flowing now, and we're not expecting deficits in the future. And this is going to help pay for the 72nd Avenue project next year, and is paying for some of the trail,
Yeah.
as is TID 11. And this, again, is a district that suffered small deficits a couple years back, but I'm not expecting any deficits going forward. And then TID 12, which at this point is a little hard to estimate exactly where we're going on this one, has a deficit of the 1.4 million. We've got a number of developer commitments out there. Increment right now is relatively small, and we are seeing some TID 7 revenue sharing. Here's the debt outstanding by TID district.
So if we rewind back to
Yep.
TID 12 for just a second, because we see the developer commitments we have out there, is this contemplating yet any tax contribution by T-Wall and Swiderski for those two big projects?
Well, I think it's contemplating all of the infrastructure requirements for the
Okay.
city.
Okay,
So, you know, when you're giving up 80% of your increment, you're not really getting a lot to
Right,
retire
right.
that debt.
right. So, okay.
And this is just a list of all of our commitments right now for each one of the districts. So our obligation to Elm Street, which is the TID 8, will be done this year in 2023. Great Lakes Cheese will be paid off by 2029. River Life is paid in 2023. Macandon is 27. Waz's demolition grant, 23, 24. And then you have the T-Wall and Swiderski, which we really haven't started yet.
Sure.
What is Macandon?
That was to do improvements to the clubhouse for
Athletic
Athletic Park.
Oh,
And then just looking at the expected termination dates of the TIDs by year. Kind of switching focus then on our internal service. So this is activities that are funding internal activities. So the motor pool had basically a net profit of 110,000, and the depreciation was 1.2 million. So really, the fund generated 1.3 million to purchase assets. We purchased $3 million worth of assets, but we had some pretty significant cash on hand. Our, I guess, unrestricted net position at the end of 2022, kind of our reserves, is 1.1 million. So you can see we drew down on reserves to pay for those extra equipment in 2021. The insurance fund grew a little bit. That's like our liability insurance, our property insurance, and then the employee benefit fund, which is health insurance. 'Cause years ago, 5 years ago, maybe, we had a self-funded plan, so we wanted to make sure and have reserves. Now we went fully insured for health insurance. We still have a self-insured dental plan, but that went up just a little bit.
Marion, quick
Yeah.
question on the motor pool. Is this reflected all the, we had some internal charge issues at some point where we weren't charging the departments properly? Have we fixed that?
Yes, 1/1/23. Yep, that was adjusted in 23.
Okay.
And then the enterprise funds, again, the net position for the water utility and wastewater, it's a little misconceived, or, what's the word, misconceived? Misleading, thank you. for 2022, because this shows our commitment of ARPA funds to the water and sewer utility, because they used it then to purchase their assets. So, you know, let's see, I have a note on that. If we had not, oh, and maybe I can show it the next thing, yeah. So if, what the, oh, I thought I was gonna put a slide in there, I guess I did, let me see if I get to my notes. And I couldn't write it down. But if I go back, you know, we contributed, I would guess, about $1 million for the water utility and $1 million for wastewater for their projects. So their net position would have been much less if we had not done that. So again, you know, I think it was a really wise move to allocate to the utilities.
And we'll see that again for 23 as well, right?
Yeah.
Because we did it for 2 years.
Yes.
Okay.
So the Metro ride looks in great shape. At the end of 2022, it had a net loss of $481,000, but, you know, its depreciation was $586, and which is, you know, a non-cash item. So its net income, it actually generated a little bit of a profit, about $100,000 profit. The parking fund, I'd like to put some additional information. I do not know what to do about the parking fund. You know, we find ourselves, COVID has had a huge impact on parking. Obviously, the mall coming down has had a huge impact on parking, where our occupancy has gone down dramatically. We changed our revenue streams when we went with the one free ticket each per year for cars
Right.
in the downtown.
And the 2 hours for free.
2 hours for free.
Yeah.
We have, you know, one of our parking enforcement people left the city's employment. We have not filled that position only because we felt that there just wasn't enough activity to really justify 2 people. But we do need to make some significant changes, and you know, we could have a parking study to have a consultant come in and make some recommendations. Yet it feels like we're in this cusp of changes to the downtown, and you hate to have someone come in when you're in the midst of changes. So I don't know. I'd like to put this on a future agenda to talk about more. But otherwise, the other funds, you know,
Well, and part of the trouble we have with parking, I think, is anytime you talk about either raising the rate, shortening the time, or any of that, you have immediate and swift backlash from business owners. Because the unique part of downtown is that not everyone has a gigantic asphalt surface lot to park their people in. And so, you know, they need those spaces to cycle out on a timely basis so that quick service businesses can serve their customers. But by the same token, they also want people to come downtown and stay a bit if they're going to eat or shop or whatever. And so there's a odd balancing act that we have to dovetail with the business community to, you know, meet needs that they have down here with downtown parking that the west side does not have. So, I mean, that's always been a struggle for us, so.
and then the final slide, just the funds that we have on hands that we're holding for others. The Entrepreneurial Center, Wausau Events, Main Street, and what was on the agenda tonight, the Cemetery Trust
Cemetery,
Fund.
yep.
So that's it.
Okay. Anybody have questions on that report at all? Recap of 2022? Okay,
See, I
Go ahead.
do have a question related to parking.
Yeah.
Just by happenstance, I met the new executive director for the Children's Imaginarium today. So she's on her second day there. And then the topic came up about the parking there. How do we, for lack of a current plan, how are we approaching those who come to us looking to make parking decisions? Like, for example, and we didn't hear it tonight, but I mean, how does that impact us? Maybe it's a small impact. I don't know
Right.
what we're doing with that.
well, I guess, you know, we sent Liz back to complete the process with them and figure out what exactly they're asking us for, so we can figure out what the impact is to the facility and the cost associated therewith. I mean, if they're looking for us to cordon off a certain number of spaces in a ramp where no one's parking anyway, that may not be a huge impact for us, but it may be a great impact for them because they can get people in and give them a place to park. So I think that's what we need to know from them is, like, how much of a need do they have? And then what really is the logistical impact to the facility? Because if they're asking for it in a facility right now that doesn't have robust usage, it may be pretty minute. I mean, the benefit may really outweigh the cost.
Well, but to Mary Ann's point, it's
Yeah.
that whole area is in flux.
Right.
You know, we might be a good time to start looking at a plan and if the way to capitalize on it, or, you know, just know where we're going. Because if we're going to be losing, if I understood that slide right, we're losing $1 million a year on that? Or we
With
lost it?
depreciation, yes.
Yeah. And
Does that include the ramp we decommissioned and we're going to demolish this year?
Yes.
Next year?
Yes.
So the revenue loss
2022 's
from the permits in there, was
Well,
that?
the revenue was in there, and those, you know, most of them have relocated to other locations, so we're still getting the revenue, but we'll save the, you know, utilities and the operational costs, so.
And the cost of the maintenance, because it
Right.
always needed work.
Right.
It seemed like there was always concrete work happening in there and stuff, so.
So the demolition will go against that fund next year, or how does that work?
So when we did the project plan for TID3, we put it in the project plan amendment that you guys adopted. So the thought was to fund it out of TID3.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Any additional questions on the 2022 report? If not, we'll place that report on file. And that brings us to the end of our agenda. We got a lot of work done tonight, but it was way longer than normal. I joked when we came out of closed session that we work a lot faster when the council meeting is starting at 6:30. So thank you, everyone, for hanging in there tonight. I'll take a motion to adjourn. Motion from Denny, second from Watson. Members in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed? Nobody's ever opposed. We'll call it a night, and we'll see everyone next week for council. Thank you.